For 113 years, the Klamath River ran backward. Not literally, but if you'd asked the salmon, they would have told you that. A river that once sent 30 to 50,000 fish charging upriver every single year had been reduced to a trickle of broken, diseased stragglers. The dams didn't just block the fish. They rewrote the entire chemistry of the water. They starved the riverside land of sediment. They cooked the river in algae blooms so thick that tribal children couldn't swim in it without their skin breaking out in rashes. And the towns along the Klamath, the ones where people used to eat well and cheaply because the river fed them, quietly stopped fishing, stopped canning, stopped living the way their grandparents did. Then, in the fall of 2023, the United States did something it had almost never done before. It removed not one, not two, but 4 dams from the Klamath River in one of the largest dam removal projects in human history. Over 700 billion gallons of trapped water were drained. Over 400 miles of river sealed off since 1912 were finally opened. And what happened next? The salmon came back, not in the cautious, trickle-in over decades way the scientists expected. They came back within weeks. Months after the last dam came down, salmon were spotted in river stretches that no living human had ever seen a salmon reach. Tribal elders who had spent their entire lives fighting for this moment wept on the riverbank. But here's the thing, the headlines missed entirely. What happened on the Klamath River isn't just a nature story. It's a food story. It's a money story. And it's a lesson about how the most affordable, most nutritious food on the planet was stolen from millions of ordinary Americans. Not by a drought, not by climate change, not by bad luck, but by 4 concrete structures that a handful of people decided to put there, and then decided never to take down. If you've been watching grocery prices climb and wondering why fish is 50% more expensive than it was 10 years ago, part of the answer is sitting in the sediment of the Klamath River basin. And if you want to understand what it actually looks like when a river feeds a community for free, the way rivers fed every community on Earth for most of human history, then you need to understand what happened here. If you want to watch more videos on how America's land, water, and food systems shape your cost of living, subscribe now and hit the bell. We cover this kind of story every single week. Let's start at the beginning. Because to understand what the dams destroyed, you have to understand what was there before them. The Klamath River begins in the high desert of southern Oregon, at a chain of shallow lakes, Klamath Lake, Agency Lake, Upper Klamath Lake, that sit at roughly 4,000 feet of elevation. From there, the river drops steeply through the Cascade and Siskiyou Mountains, carving a canyon so dramatic that early European explorers thought they'd found a passage to the Pacific that rivaled the Columbia. By the time the Klamath reaches the coast near Klamath, California, a small community that sits almost exactly on the Oregon-California border, it has dropped roughly 4,000 feet in about 260 miles. That's an enormous amount of energy moving through a very short distance. And that energy, for thousands of years, was what made the Klamath one of the most productive salmon rivers on the entire Pacific coast. Salmon need cold, clean, fast-moving water with clean gravel beds on the bottom. They need to be able to swim from the ocean all the way upstream to the place where they were born, sometimes hundreds of miles to spawn, lay their eggs in those gravel beds, and die. Their bodies decompose into the riverbed and the surrounding forest. Their carcasses feed bears, eagles, otters, insects, and eventually, through the food chain, every other species in the watershed. The river feeds on the salmon as much as the salmon feeds on the river. It is one of the most intricate, self-sustaining food systems that exists anywhere on Earth. The Karuk, Yurok, Hoopa Valley, and Klamath tribes had been living inside this system for at least 10,000 years. Their entire culture, their spiritual practices, their medicine, their social structures, their economy, was built around the salmon run. When the salmon came, which they did every year in spring and again in fall, entire communities turned out to the river. Women dried and smoked the fish on elaborate wooden racks. Men built elaborate weir traps out of woven willow barriers that stretched partway across the river, designed to funnel fish into a trap while always allowing a percentage to pass upstream to spawn. Nobody kept everything. The system required that enough fish get through to maintain the next year's run. The tribes had been managing this fishery sustainably, more sustainably than any government program has ever managed it for 100 centuries. When explorers and settlers began arriving in the mid-1800s, they documented the Klamath salmon run with descriptions that sound almost unbelievable today. One federal surveyor in the 1850s wrote that the river was so thick with salmon during the spring run that you could almost walk across their backs. Tribal accounts describe the water turning silver in the canyon during peak season. Early canneries in the 1870s and 1880s processed millions of pounds of Klamath salmon every year and shipped them up and down the west coast and eventually to Europe. The fish were that abundant, and the people who lived there ate extraordinarily well, at essentially zero cost, year after year after year. That's the baseline. That's what the dams were built into. The first dam on the Klamath was Copco 1, completed in 1918 by a California power company called Pacific Power and Light. It sat about 40 miles upstream from the Oregon border, on a stretch of river where the canyon walls drop almost vertically on both sides. From an engineering standpoint, it was a near-perfect dam site. The canyon walls provided natural abutments. The river gradient was steep enough to generate enormous hydraulic pressure. The dam was almost 200 feet tall, and it had no fish ladder. Fish ladders, the step channels that allow salmon to pass around a dam, were already standard practice. By 1918, the technology existed, but including a fish ladder would have cost more money and potentially reduced the energy output of the dam. Pacific Power and Light decided the salmon weren't worth the expense. A state water board in California agreed, and with that decision, approximately 200 miles of Klamath River spawning habitat was permanently sealed off from the Pacific Ocean. Copco 2 came in 1925. Iron Gate Dam, the largest and lowest on the river, closest to the coast, was completed in 1964. J.C. Boyle Dam in Oregon was completed in 1958. By the time Iron Gate went in, the damage was essentially complete. The four dams together blocked fish passage on roughly 30% of the Klamath's historical salmon habitat. But the physical blockage wasn't even the worst part. The reservoirs, the lakes that backed up behind the dams, changed the entire biology of the river. Cold, fast-moving water became slow, warm, still water. Algae thrived in the warm, still water, fed by the agricultural runoff coming off of the farms and ranches in the upper basin. Every summer, particularly in drought years, the reservoirs filled with toxic cyanobacteria, blue-green algae that released chemicals into the water that were lethal to juvenile salmon and toxic to humans and animals. In 2002, one of the worst fish kills in American history occurred on the lower Klamath, where fish biologists estimated that 33,000 adult Chinook salmon fish that had already survived the ocean and were returning home to spawn died in a single week from a combination of low water conditions, warm temperatures, and a bacterial disease called columnarus that thrives in stressed fish populations. The carcasses piled up on the riverbanks for miles. The tribal communities downstream watched it happen, and they had been watching versions of it happen, in lesser scale, every year since the dams went in. The economic impact on the tribes was catastrophic and has never been fully calculated. Before the dams, the Yurok tribe alone harvested an estimated 500,000 pounds of salmon per year from the Klamath. Not commercially for subsistence. That's food. Free food, nutritious food, high protein, high omega-3 food that their families had eaten year-round for generations in dried and smoked form. After the dams, that harvest collapsed. By the 1980s, tribal salmon harvests had declined by more than 90% from pre-dam levels. The Yurok, the Karuk, and other river tribes communities that were already among the most economically impoverished in the state lost their primary food source. They weren't receiving Social Security benefits. They weren't receiving federal food programs that adequately substituted for what the river used to provide. They were simply left with less food and no recourse. When you drive through Humboldt County or Siskiyou County today and see small rural communities with high rates of food insecurity, you are looking in part at the downstream consequences of those four dams. The connection isn't abstract. It's caloric. It's direct. And the tribes weren't the only ones who suffered. The commercial salmon fishery on the entire northern California and southern Oregon coast has been in crisis for decades. The Klamath River historically produced a significant percentage of the Chinook salmon that were caught by commercial fleets operating out of ports like Eureka, Crescent City, and Brookings. When the Klamath runs collapsed, those fleets had less to catch. The federal government has been paying out disaster relief to West Coast salmon fishermen periodically since the early 2000s, most recently in 2023, when the Chinook salmon season was essentially closed entirely on much of the coast because the stock was too depleted to sustain any commercial harvest. That disaster relief comes from taxpayer money. You paid for it. The dams cost you money in ways you were never told about. And of course, if you buy salmon at the grocery store, if you've noticed that a pound of wild Pacific Chinook has gone from $12 to $25 to sometimes $40 a pound over the past 2 decades, part of what you're paying for is the absence of the Klamath runs. Reduced supply means higher prices. The dams cost every American who eats fish more money every time they go to the store. That's not an exaggeration. That's economics. Now, here's where this story turns. In the early 2000s, a coalition of tribes, environmental groups, commercial fishermen, and crucially, some of the power companies themselves began seriously discussing dam removal. The dams were old. COPCO 1 had been operating for nearly 90 years. The licenses to operate them were up for federal renewal, and the cost of upgrading them to modern environmental standards, which would include functional fish ladders, mandatory water temperature controls, and mitigation for the algae blooms, was going to be enormous. Pacify Corp., the company that now owned the dams, did its own math and came to a surprising conclusion. It would be cheaper to remove the dams than to fix them. That's a sentence worth sitting with. 113 years of damage to one of the most productive river ecosystems in North America, and the ultimate decision to undo it was made in part because the cost-benefit analysis finally no longer supported keeping the concrete in place. The federal relicensing process ground forward. The tribes negotiated, environmental groups sued, commercial fishermen testified. State agencies in California and Oregon weighed in. Federal agencies weighed in. And in 2010, the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement was signed, a landmark document that committed Pacify Corp. And a coalition of federal and state agencies to pursuing dam removal if certain conditions were met. Then the legal and administrative process took another 13 years. This is, as much as anything, the part of the story that should make you angry. Not at any particular villain necessarily, but at the sheer inertia of a system that can identify a mistake, agree that the mistake needs to be corrected, and then spend 13 years correcting it. 13 years, during which the algae kept blooming, the fish kept struggling, the tribes kept watching their river slowly die, and the grocery store prices kept climbing. The actual demolition work began in January 2023. It started with Iron Gate Dam, the lowest dam closest to the coast, the last one to be built, and the first one to come down. A company called Kiewit Infrastructure handled the demolition work. They used a combination of traditional excavation equipment and controlled breaching, essentially cutting a notch in the dam to allow the reservoir to drain, then systematically removing the remaining structure piece by piece. The scale of the operation was staggering. The 4 reservoirs, Iron Gate Lake, Copco Lake 1, Copco Lake 2, and J.C. Boyle Reservoir, held a combined total of roughly 2.4 million acre-feet of water. An acre-foot is about 326,000 gallons, which means the 4 reservoirs together held something in the neighborhood of 780 billion gallons of water. All of that had to be carefully released downstream without causing catastrophic flooding. The Yurok tribe and other downstream communities had been preparing for this for years, working with hydrologists to model the expected sediment pulse, the enormous load of fine sediment that had been trapped in the reservoirs for a century and would now be released all at once. The sediment question was, in fact, the single biggest ecological concern of the entire project. 100 years of trapped material, silt, sand, organic matter, some of it laced with agricultural chemicals and pollutants, was going to flush down the river when the reservoirs drained. Scientists predicted it would cloud the water brown for months. They predicted it might temporarily harm fish and invertebrates downstream. They were right about all of that. The lower Klamath ran brown and murky through much of 2023 as the sediment worked its way to the sea. But underneath the concern about sediment was an extraordinary process happening simultaneously. As the reservoirs drained, they exposed the ancient riverbed, the actual channel that the Klamath had carved over thousands of years before the dams were ever built. And that riverbed, despite a century of submersion, was not dead. Buried in the silt were seeds, root systems, rhizomes, and spores of plants that had been waiting. Some of them had been waiting for 100 years. Within months of the reservoir draining, botanists recorded the spontaneous germination of native plant species across the exposed reservoir floor. Willow and alder took root along the banks. Native grasses pushed up through the sediment. The process that ecologists call passive restoration, essentially letting the ecosystem rebuild itself without human intervention, was already underway before the last dam came down. The last of the 4 dams, Kopko 1, the original, the one that started all of this in 1918, was removed by September of 2024. By that point, 418 miles of river and stream habitat were accessible to salmon for the first time in over a century, and the fish were already moving. The first verified adult Chinook salmon above the former Iron Gate Dam site were photographed in November 2023, within weeks of the dam's removal. This was faster than almost anyone had predicted. Salmon are programmed by scent and instinct to return to their home streams. But scientists had assumed that the fish currently in the ocean, the ones that had been born in the accessible stretches of river below the dams, wouldn't know where to go in the newly opened habitat. They would have no ancestral memory of those upper reaches. What happened instead was that the salmon followed the river. They followed the water chemistry, the temperature gradients, the scent of the newly exposed gravel. They found stretches of clean, cold, fast-moving water in the upper Klamath, and they began to use them, not in the enormous numbers of the pre-dam era that will take time, perhaps a generation of salmon, perhaps more, but in numbers that genuinely surprised researchers. By the spring of 2024, monitoring surveys were documenting salmon and steelhead in river sections that had not seen these fish in living memory. Yurok tribal monitors, trained in traditional ecological knowledge as well as modern fisheries science, were among the first to spot them. Elders who had spent decades fighting this fight drove to the river to see for themselves. The photographs and videos that circulated through tribal networks showed something that looked almost exactly like grief running in reverse. There's a Karuk word, azayak, that roughly translates to something like the moment of return, or the returning. Tribal members used it in interviews when describing what they saw. Now, what does all of this mean for food and for cost of living? Because that's the heart of this story. Wild Pacific salmon is among the most nutritionally dense foods that exists. A 3.5-ounce serving of wild Chinook provides about 230 calories, over 25 grams of protein, and extraordinary levels of omega-3 fatty acids, the kind that have been shown in study after study to reduce cardiovascular disease, support brain development in children, reduce inflammation, and improve outcomes in a remarkable range of chronic conditions. This is not a supplement. This is not a processed food product. This is a real, whole food that came out of a river for free. The Yurok people, during the period of the salmon runs, processed and preserved enormous quantities of fish. They smoke-dried it on wooden racks, a method that removes moisture and creates a shelf-stable product that keeps for months without refrigeration. They rendered the fat and used it as a nutritional supplement in winter months. They traded dried salmon with inland tribes in exchange for other foods and materials, creating an economy of mutual sufficiency that didn't require cash, didn't require a supply chain, and didn't require a gas-powered vehicle to access. This is what people mean when they talk about traditional food sovereignty. It's not a romantic abstraction. It's a very practical description of a food system that cost almost nothing, produced excellent nutrition, was locally controlled, and had been sustainably maintained for thousands of years. The dams ended it. Not gradually, abruptly, legally, and with the full sanction of the state of California and the federal government. The restoration of the Klamath runs won't restore that system overnight. It may never fully restore it. The tribes have lost not only the fish, but the knowledge, the specific, granular, generational knowledge of exactly where to fish, at what time of year, which pools to work, which tributaries ran hottest with fish in a dry year versus a wet year. Some of that knowledge survived. Much of it was lost. Rebuilding it will take generations, but the practical implications for cost of living in the communities along the Klamath River are already beginning to materialize. The Yurok tribe has stated explicitly that one of their core goals for the post-dam restoration is the resumption of subsistence fishing, not just as a cultural practice, but as a genuine food security strategy for tribal members who face high rates of poverty and food insecurity. When a family can catch, smoke, and store 50 or 100 pounds of salmon in a season, that family's grocery bill for the winter looks fundamentally different. When a community can do that collectively, the economic impact compounds, and the implications extend beyond the tribal communities. Commercial salmon fishing on the northern California coast has been a significant source of employment and food supply for generations of non-tribal fishermen and their families. A restored Klamath run, even partially restored, would mean more Chinook in the ocean, more fish available for harvest, and eventually lower prices at the counter. This doesn't happen in a season. The salmon have 3 to 5 year life cycles. Fish, born in the restored Upper Klamath in 2024, won't return as adults until 2027 at the earliest. But the trajectory is set. Some fisheries economists have estimated that a fully restored Klamath run, one that approaches the pre-dam numbers, could support a commercial and tribal fishery worth several $100 million per year on the coast. That's jobs, that's food. That's money staying in rural communities that have been economically hollowed out for decades. There's a broader lesson in this, and it's one that's easy to lose in the specifics of the Klamath story, but impossible to ignore once you see it. For most of human history, in most places on Earth, rivers were the primary food infrastructure of the communities that lived along them. Not farms, not supply chains, not grocery stores. Rivers. The salmon coming up the Klamath, the shad running up the Connecticut River every spring, the massive carp and catfish populations in the Missouri and Mississippi that fed entire native nations, the steelhead in the tributaries of the Columbia that sustained communities from the coast all the way into Idaho and Montana. These were not primitive, subsistence-level food sources that people were glad to move on from. They were extraordinarily productive, essentially free, self-replenishing systems that required minimal energy input and produced maximum nutritional output. We didn't evolve away from them because we found something better. We were removed from them, systematically, by a combination of industrial development, dam construction, pollution, over-harvesting, and legal dispossession. The average American family living near a river today does not think of that river as a food source. They've been conditioned not to. The infrastructure that made rivers edible, the knowledge of where to fish, how to preserve the catch, how to build a weir, how to smoke and dry and store, has been almost entirely dismantled in most communities over the past century. The Klamath Dam removal is the largest single step America has ever taken toward undoing some of that damage. It is not sufficient. It will not, by itself, reverse 100 years of industrial fishing, pollution, and habitat destruction across the entire West Coast salmon ecosystem. But it is a proof of concept. It demonstrates, concretely and visually and in ways that even the most committed skeptic has to acknowledge, that the damage can be undone, that rivers can come back, that fish can find their way home, even after a century of exile. And it asks a question that extends far beyond the Klamath. There are more than 90,000 dams in the United States. The vast majority of them are small agricultural diversions, old mill dams, low-head dams on creeks and tributaries, but they collectively block fish passage on a scale that most Americans have never thought about. Many of them are aging, structurally compromised, and no longer serving any meaningful economic purpose. Their removal would cost money, but in most cases, that cost is offset, over time, by the economic value of the restored fisheries they would unlock. the reduced liability they represent, and the water quality improvements that would follow. The American Rivers Organization estimates that roughly 2,800 dams across the country have been removed in the last 30 years. Most of those removals have been on small streams, and most of them have produced rapid ecological recovery fish, returning within weeks, riparian vegetation re-establishing within months, insect populations recovering within years. The pattern is remarkably consistent. The Klamath is the biggest, most dramatic example. But it is not the only one. The Elwha River dams in Washington state came down in 2011 and 2014, and the salmon response there was similarly rapid and similarly startling. The White Salmon River in Washington had its Condit Dam removed in 2011, and Chinook were documented spawning in previously inaccessible reaches within a year of removal. The rivers want to work. The fish want to come home. The question is whether we're willing to get out of the way. For communities living along rivers where dams block salmon runs, and there are many such communities across the Pacific Northwest, the Northeast, and parts of the Great Lakes region, that question has a direct dollar value attached to it. Restored fisheries mean food. Food that costs nothing to harvest except time, skill, and the knowledge of how to do it. Food that, once preserved, sustains a family through months. Food that, at current market prices, represents an extraordinary economic asset for anyone who has access to it. The Yurok tribe has been preparing for this. For years before the dams came down, they were training tribal members in traditional ecological knowledge and traditional food preservation methods. They've established a tribal hatchery program to supplement the natural recovery. They've worked with fisheries biologists to develop monitoring protocols that will track the returning population year by year and inform decisions about when and how much tribal subsistence harvesting can responsibly occur. They are, in other words, building the infrastructure for free food. For a community that has been food insecure for generations, this is not a small thing. It is, in the most literal possible sense, a matter of survival. And the thing that no headline has quite said directly is this: what happened on the Klamath River is not an environmental story. Or it's not only an environmental story. It is a story about what happens when you return control of a food system to the people who lived inside it for thousands of years and understand how it works. It is a story about what becomes possible when you remove an extractive industrial structure that was serving the financial interests of a power company and returning approximately nothing to the communities downstream. The salmon came back because the river wanted them back. The river wanted them back because a century of advocacy, legal struggle, scientific documentation, and political negotiation finally produced the specific outcome: the removal of 4 concrete structures that allowed the natural system to reassert itself. For the Yurok child who can now watch salmon move through water her grandparents never saw salmon in, that is everything. For the family in Crescent City or Eureka, who may, in 5 or 10 years, be able to buy locally caught wild Klamath Chinook at a price they can afford, or who may, with the right knowledge, to be able to catch it themselves, it is something more practical, but equally profound. Rivers fed people for a very long time. On the Klamath, they're beginning to do it again. The fish came home. And they brought the future with them. If you found this video valuable, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Every week, we look at the systems behind your cost of living. The land, the water, the food infrastructure that shapes what you pay and what you have access to. If you know someone who's been watching grocery prices and wondering why everything costs more, share this with them. The answers are in the river. They always were.